happy and proud to be able to welcome Michalinos Zembylas. First of all, who's we? We are a group of people who are working on a project called Decolonizing Education for Peace in Africa. It's a multi-country project with 11 country members, where we're trying to look at local values and knowledges of peace and trying to develop a whole educational pedagogies for people in multiple countries, but also developing open education resources. So that's who we are. But much more importantly for today, I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to Michalinos Zembylas. He's a professor of education theory and curriculum studies at the Open University of Cyprus and an honorary professor at the Nelson Mandela University in the chair for critical studies in higher education transformation. So if you've worked on socially just pedagogies, on peace education, on humanizing pedagogies, there's really little chance that you haven't read his work, because he's been such a leader in this field with so many publications and books that have become sort of central to defining this field. In 2016, he received the Distinguished Researcher Award in Social Sciences and Humanities from the Cyprus Research Promotion Foundation. But he's also written on citizenship, on human rights education, and including, very importantly at the moment, on affect and the rise of right-wing populism, something which I think many of us are struggling with across the world. I've just come from Italy, and this was, and you can really see this over there. So it's my pleasure to be able to welcome Michalinos here to speak to us today. His topic today for his the title of his speech is Reframing Humanizing Pedagogies as with Decolonizing Pedagogies. So thank you so much, Michalinos.
Thank you, Parvati. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. Let me upload my presentation. So what I'm going to try to talk about today is a paper that I published 2 years ago, but kind of reworked with new ideas, and hopefully will have plenty of things to talk about when I'm done. I'm planning to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes or so. And then we have plenty of time for discussion. So calls for decolonizing South African higher education are not new. The colonial structures of African universities have been critiqued for decades now. Certainly prior to the latest and current movements, especially Fees Must Fall. Although decolonization means different things to different people in different contexts, and certainly it has different dimensions, such as the political, economic, cultural, material, and epistemic, I understand decolonization here in broad terms. So I'm going to provide a definition that I will be using today, and I'm using Stein and Andreotti here. Decolonization as an umbrella term for diverse efforts to resist the distinct but intertwined processes of colonization and racialization, to enact transformation and redress in reference to the historical and ongoing effects of these processes, and to create and keep alive modes of knowing, being, and relating that these processes seek to eradicate. Although there have been considerable efforts to explore what decolonization means at the level of university curricula, there has been less theorization of what decolonization might imply for higher education, pedagogy, and praxis. I argue that there is a political and pragmatic need to reflect critically on what it means to decolonize higher education pedagogies, not only in South Africa, of course, but also beyond that. Given that there is complicity of existing higher education institutions in colonial structures, as some scholars argue, it is important to generate new pedagogical language and praxis that go beyond the Eurocentric epistemologies of pedagogies in African universities. My presentation today then attempts to bring into conversation decolonial thinking with what is referred to as humanizing pedagogy. Humanizing pedagogy is understood here as a form of pedagogy that obviously has its roots in Freire's notion of humanization and focuses on the pursuit of one's full humanity. My argument is that Freirean-based humanizing pedagogy, which is rooted in Eurocentric perspectives of criticality and critical pedagogy, can benefit considerably by looking more closely into insights from what Walter Mignolo calls decolonial thinking. The question that drives my presentation then is the following: what are the links between humanization and the decolonization of higher education? And what does this imply for pedagogical praxis? My attempt to respond to this question hopes to offer valuable insights that reconfigure humanizing pedagogy in relation to a decolonial project of social transformation. I will argue that even quote unquote noble ideas such as Freirean-based humanizing pedagogies need to be constantly scrutinized to avoid becoming complicit with the rhetoric of status quo. Needless to say, decolonial theories and pedagogies themselves are not exempt from such scrutinization. So I hope that you will not be seeing this as an erasure of humanizing pedagogy. On the contrary, I'm arguing that we need to bring together decolonial thinking to enrich and reframe humanizing pedagogy. So I will begin with a brief synthesis of insights from decolonial perspectives and their implications for higher education. I then introduce different decolonial discourses in South African higher education, highlighting three possible responses around decolonization. This part is followed by presenting how a particular form of pedagogy, namely humanizing pedagogy, partakes in these responses by sometimes reproducing the colonial order. And finally, I conclude with some reflections on how humanizing pedagogies might be reconceptualized through the lens of decolonial perspectives and what this might imply for South African higher education and perhaps even beyond that. First of all, there is an important distinction to be made between colonialism and coloniality. The term coloniality refers to the continuity of colonial forms of domination after the end of colonial administrations produced by colonial cultures and structures in the modern colonial capitalist patriarchal world system. Maldonado Torres also describes coloniality as a system that defines the organization and dissemination of epistemic, material, and aesthetic resources in ways that reproduce modernity's colonial project. Colonialism is understood as a temporal period of oppression that has come and gone, while coloniality is the underlying logic that places peoples and knowledge into a classification system that valorizes all that is European, something which is very much with us today. A similar distinction can be made between decolonization and decoloniality. Decoloniality refers to the everyday and ongoing efforts to challenge persistent forms of coloniality, whereas decolonization is mostly tied to the historical period after World War II, in which various movements by indigenous peoples and their descendants across the Americas, Africa, and Asia began to challenge external colonialism. Given that decolonial scholars emphasize that indigenous, enslaved, and colonized peoples have resisted colonialism from its inception more than 500 years ago, one might also argue that decolonization is very much an ongoing process. In general, decolonization is a concept that takes on different meanings across different contexts, yet it basically highlights two important ideas. First, it evokes a historical narrative that resists Eurocentrism and acknowledges the contributions of colonized populations across the globe. And second, it emphasizes a moral imperative for righting the wrongs of colonial domination and an ethical stance in relation to social justice for those peoples enslaved and disempowered by persistent forms of coloniality. Decoloniality challenges social categories such as race, gender, and sexuality as inventions of colonial capitalism that hold symbolic and material significance for how individuals and groups experience the world. Therefore, decoloniality favors analysis, art forms, and actions that practice what Mignolo calls epistemic disobedience. That is, they move away from the categories of Eurocentric thought to engage with ideas that have been marginalized and discredited as uncivilized and barbarian. When it comes to higher education in particular, these decolonial perspectives highlight the complicity of higher education. And I'm using here specifically the work of my good friend and colleague, Andre Kitt from Nelson Mandela University. Modern universities, from their very inception, were complicit in and benefited from colonization, from the colonial cataloging of non-Western knowledge and the production of knowledge in support of scientific racism and other racialized and colonial classifications, to claims about the universality of Western knowledge. Western epistemological dominance occurs not only in higher education within the West, but also in the non-West, where Western institutions are often viewed as the model for the ideal university. Decolonization then means challenging all forms of coloniality that still persist in higher education and that are complicit in colonial oppression. Decolonizing knowledge involves collective education, collective systemic and systematic processes of dismantling the ways in which higher education discourses and practices perpetuate cognitive injustices, from the systems of access and management in universities, the systems of authoritative control, standardization, classification, commodification, accountancy, and bureaucratization reflected in the organizational structures, the teaching methods and assessment mechanisms of students and faculty alike, the research practices and publishing norms, to the curricular content and design of courses. And here I'm using Achille Mbembe and all these examples that he provides about the colonization of higher education discourses and practices. It has been argued that since their inception, South African universities adopted Western models of academic organization, which largely excluded the knowledge of colonized people. And this is, of course, not common only to South Africa. In my own country, Cyprus, as a colony or as a British colony, the establishment of the first university and consequently follows a similar historical development. Back in South Africa now, prior to 1994, there have been serious attempts within the transformation agendas of several past and present higher education initiatives to changing highly problematic institutional cultures, as well as their colonial structures and practices. So the idea of decolonization is not really something new. Some examples include the work of Neville Alexander, academics within the higher education sector such as Mahmoud Mamdani, among several others, and movements such as people's education in the 1980s. Now, following the end of apartheid, the discourse of transformation in higher education has come at the center of debates, focusing initially on the need for greater access, including epistemological access, for more Black students. Although progress has been made over the last 25 years, for example, universities have consistently tried to challenge a narrow view of transformation. There is still considerable work to be done in the sector that has become known as higher education transformation, to change highly problematic institutional cultures, as well as their colonial structures and practices, also pedagogical practices. Some African scholars argue that one of the worst forms of colonization in Africa is the epistemological one, that is the colonization of imagination and the mind that is hidden in institutions and discourses that govern the modern globe. Given the Eurocentric nature and practices of the disciplines and universities in African higher education, it is argued that there is a systematic marginalization of that which is designated as African. The issue then is not simply about access versus non-access. It has also to do with the dominance of Eurocentrism and the epistemic violence that still persists in various forms in South African universities. Although there are ongoing terminological debates whether decolonization needs to replace transformation, or whether transformation is a much broader and complicated process than decolonization, things are much more complicated in my view. The term we choose is important as long as the political project of decolonization or transformation, for that matter, goes beyond simply admitting coloniality in higher education and takes action step by step or with more radical moves to dismantle the epistemic injustices that persist in the higher education system of post-apartheid South Africa. There are important questions then that can be raised about the decolonial possibilities of higher education transformation, such as to what extent is it possible to decolonize South African universities without larger social transformation? If universities continue to reproduce a colonial order of knowledge and therefore the existing social system, what approaches might dismantle this colonial order? Is it even possible to produce alternative knowledges, African knowledges, for example, without essentializing them or eventually assimilating them into Western epistemological frameworks? Clearly, there are no easy responses to these questions, and I'm not planning to provide answers to all of these questions today. Yet I want to briefly sketch 3 approaches to the decolonization of higher education that have been proposed. And again, I'm using Stein and Andreotti here. The first response would be what Vanessa Andreotti and her colleagues call soft reform. That is, interventions that focus on increased access and the inclusion of marginalized groups, for example, Black, low-income students and faculty, and the supplementation of existing curricula with non-Western perspectives. For example, when it comes to the university curriculum, it has been suggested that this additive approach, that is the addition of new items to an existing curriculum, is promoted by South African universities that want to maintain the status quo. Eurocentric worldviews are still dominant in the university curriculum, but a so-called African voice is inserted to claim that transformation is taking place. The second response would be radical reform, namely an approach that advocates for fundamental changes and argues that the changes made through soft reform are tokenistic, incomplete, insufficient, and inadequate. Radical reform emphasizes the decolonization of higher education as a consciousness that rejects the values, norms, and worldviews imposed by the colonizers, and a commitment to empower marginalized groups, address Eurocentrism at all levels of higher education, and redistribute material resources. For South African universities, for example, this set of approaches would entail reframing the purposes of the university and what it means at all levels. For example, administration and leadership, research, scholarship, curriculum, pedagogy, and so on. Finally, the third response could be what Andreotti and her colleagues call beyond reform. That is a set of approaches that go beyond the previous one in recognizing the fundamentally violent and unsustainable system within which the university is embedded. For some, these approaches might imply the need to completely dismantle the university system, abolish it as we know it, as this has been an integral part of the historical conditions of colonialism. For others, the academy may be a space of contestation in which decoloniality can actually take place. So there is a variety of perspectives on what this third response might imply. In any case, my point is that decoloniality implies some kind of praxis that ought to be transformative. I argue then that paying attention to the contribution of pedagogical praxis is an important element of the colonial processes. By pedagogical practices, I don't mean teaching methods in the strict sense, but rather pedagogies as processes, practices, and paths of struggle that oppose ongoing colonization on an everyday basis and seek to reclaim humanity beyond its colonial legacy. So in this sense, public pedagogies is one of these forms. To show what this means and what challenges emerge, I take on a popular form of critical pedagogy, namely Freirean-based humanizing pedagogy, and discuss its convergences and divergences with decolonial pedagogy and praxis. Now, I choose to focus on Freirean-based humanizing pedagogy and praxis for two reasons. First, pedagogy and praxis in general bring to the fore questions of decoloniality's how, rather than limiting the conversation to curriculum content. And second, I want to turn attention to the idea that even quote unquote noble ideas and practices such as humanizing pedagogy might be complicit with colonial aims if they are not constantly interrogated. And that pretty much holds for everything, including the colonial theory itself. Humanizing pedagogy, now to give you a short definition, is a form of critical pedagogy grounded in Freire's conceptualization of humanization and pedagogy as a counter practice to dehumanization in education. Salazar traces the roots of humanizing pedagogy to the notion of humanism, a central component of Freire's philosophy, guided by the idea that humans are motivated by a need to reason, which shapes their experiences towards achieving personal and collective self-actualization, thus developing their full humanity. In addition to the conceptualization of humanization, key to Freire's project is his understanding of the term pedagogy. Freire highlights pedagogy in a much broader sense than merely a teaching method. He emphasizes that pedagogy is the entanglement of philosophy, politics, and practice, which demands that educators engage themselves and the students in transforming oppressive social conditions. In this sense, all pedagogy is political and functions as public pedagogy. That is, as a form that constantly involves pedagogical encounters with others. This broadened conception of pedagogy includes public sites of pedagogy, offering opportunities for educational researchers, practitioners, and activists to mobilize alternative forms of counter-hegemonic learning. Humanizing pedagogy, then, is a way of living in the world rather than a collection of technical pedagogical practices or methods. In general, humanizing pedagogy is described by Freire as a revolutionary approach that engages educators and students in mutual humanization through a problem-posing process and dialogue that are aimed at critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is understood, and I quote Freire, as learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality, end of quote. This process of critical reflection and action, Freire suggests, can transform oppressive structures that prevent the realization of one's humanness, thus facilitating liberation for all. Educators, therefore, are responsible for creating the conditions suitable to promoting a more fully human world through their pedagogical practices. Now, in the South African context, humanizing pedagogy has been embraced as a practice of facilitating rehumanization at schools and tertiary institutions in the aftermath of apartheid. I don't have the time to provide a review of the rich work of scholars on humanizing pedagogy, but here are some names: Keith, Zinn, and Proteus, Aslam Fadar, Zinn, Adam, Kurup, and Duplessis, Roux, and Becker are some of the, and I'm happy to share the references for those who are interested in reading their analysis of humanizing pedagogies. Now, despite these promises by humanizing pedagogy, though, and its emancipatory rhetoric, Freirean framed pedagogies have also been critiqued over the years. For example, some scholars point out that Freirean pedagogy is grounded in European humanism and Enlightenment assumptions. Freire is also critiqued for his essentialist understanding of the oppressed and his failure to take into account the complexity of the nature of oppression and of the interchangeability of roles between oppressor and oppressed. So a sense of essentialism in these definitions of these terms. Thus, it is suggested that humanizing pedagogy as a form of critical pedagogy not only entails problematic dualism, such as oppressed and oppressor, or empowered and disempowered, or dominant and subordinate, but also fails to imagine alternative manifestations of criticality that go beyond rationalistic and teleological assumptions. These limitations include, for example, the overtly romantic and idealist notions of the equalization of the roles between teachers and students, the dichotomies between teachers' school dominant knowledge and students' experiential subordinate knowledge, and the conviction that students' knowledge is a form of false consciousness. Others have also suggested that in its overly rationalistic assumptions, Freire-based humanizing pedagogies overlook the complexity of students' emotional investments, in particular social positions and discourses. And I have written on this extensively along with Megan Bowler and other colleagues. Some of the most productive critiques of Freire-based humanizing pedagogies have come from scholars who have adopted decolonial and indigenous perspectives. Maori scholar Tuhiwari's Linda Smith, for example, discusses how critical approaches have failed because they have not taken into consideration the local characteristics of oppression. Also, other decolonial and indigenous scholars emphasize that it is important to acknowledge the significant differences between critical theory and pedagogy, multiculturalism, and cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and decolonizing projects on the other. As they argue, Freire's situating of the work of liberation in the minds of the oppressed as a humanist self-critique is different from decolonizing projects that always position the work of liberation in the particularities of colonization and the structures of the colonization project. A decolonial critique places colonialism at the center of its intervention, which is absent from being named explicitly in Freire's discussion. In general, these critiques of Freirean theory and pedagogy with which I concur emphasize two important ideas that need to be taken into consideration in reconfiguring humanizing pedagogy as with decolonial pedagogy. First, the assumptions underlying humanizing pedagogy cannot be taken for granted. but rather they need to be revisited, especially in contexts that are to be decolonized, such as the South African context. Second, a careful analysis of Freire's limitations and contributions is vital and productive for supporting different social justice projects. Rethinking humanizing pedagogies, then, must include a deeper understanding of the dynamic interplay between oppressed and oppressor, as well as the complexity of the nature of oppression. Humanizing pedagogies could benefit from complementary theoretical perspectives such as decolonial thinking. I want to conclude then by showing what humanizing pedagogies as decolonizing pedagogies could mean in South African higher education. In particular, I want to share two ways this may happen. The first way is to draw from various theoretical frameworks such as postcolonial studies, critical race theory, Black feminist theory, and so on, so that pedagogical spaces are created to recontextualize humanizing pedagogies from decolonial perspectives. A major assumption of a decolonizing pedagogy is that there is recognition of the direct and material relation between the political processes and social structures of colonialism on the one hand, and Western regimes of knowledge and representation on the other. Humanizing pedagogies, therefore, can become decolonizing pedagogies when they involve a reframing of pedagogical practices and theoretical frameworks so that they are forced to explicitly confront coloniality with the aim of dismantling colonial practices. In higher education, this task would imply pedagogies that pursue the development of human relations that resist coloniality and struggle to transform the conditions of human existence at all possible levels. For example, such pedagogical practices require a profound commitment to solidarity as a decolonizing strategy that reconceptualizes humanization as a site of relationality and interdependency by recasting day-to-day relations and encounters with difference. The second way is to recognize and take an active stance against the multiple ways in which knowledge production in the neoliberal order is implicated in the material conditions of coloniality and its persisting effects. As noted by several scholars in South Africa, work at the curriculum level is not enough. The radical decolonization of higher education implies making subjugated knowledge key points of reference in engendering pedagogies of solidarity that reject colonial privilege while confronting how Eurocentric supremacy continues to inform what legitimate knowledge is. Now, to conclude, higher educators, not only in South Africa, but also beyond this context, will need to interrogate the pedagogical practices emerging from Eurocentric knowledge approaches by drawing on and twisting these very practices. These efforts can provide spaces to enact decolonial pedagogies that reclaim colonized practices. Humanizing pedagogies as decolonizing pedagogies have to move beyond Freirean approaches, not only because Freirean approaches highlight the human as the unit of liberation, whereas decolonizing pedagogy has to denaturalize the categories of the human and humanism, but also because the knowledge emerging from the counter narratives of various agents in colonial or colonized settings has to be foregrounded rather than backgrounded. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm eager to hear your comments and thoughts and questions. They don't have to be only questions. You can also comment and make, you know, and hear your own thoughts about the ideas that I shared with you.
Thank you so much, Michalinos. It was a really riveting talk and really important, actually, for us at the Open University. As you may know, the Open Universities were all set up very much in following in the kind of wake of Freire, and I think he was the second person, somebody at the university, perhaps Darren, I think, might be here, and he might be able to tell us, or Astrid, that I think he was the second person in the university to get the annual kind of award from the university after the Open University started. So, of course, engaging deeply with these thoughts and ideas is so important for all of us. So we open this up for questions and comments very much as was said today. Karen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask questions? Just introduce yourself as well, please. Karen Ashike.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't hear. No matter whether you're in Cyprus or South Africa, people are on land. That's, for most people, changing quite rapidly, not to improve, but to deteriorate. And I think it's true in the United States, particularly, that our indigenous groups have a much better idea of what should be done on land and in social relationships with other people in their groups and with a larger group than colonial ideas about that. I'm wondering if that is a reasonable place to start in almost every nation, while there are still people around who have this, ancient knowledge of how to survive in a variety of situations, as a core of teachers, and even at the university level, it might need to start there to decolonialize the topic of discussion. What is the most important now for medicine, for food security, for use of water and resources, and for sustaining human life, and to try and make as public as possible the using resources to make as public as possible that discussion that actually goes down to the level of smaller communities for their input and problem solving around these issues. That's our guidance comes from the earth itself, whatever land we're on. And I think it's the only thing we can really rely on is the human mind that's able to translate those messages and share them with the rest of the community to find solutions to problems that people are having and to change.
Yeah.
Just a comment on that as a focus.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. I couldn't agree more with you. You're absolutely right. The issue of land is something that is foregrounded by many indigenous scholars and other groups. And the rest of us you're right. We have to listen to those claims. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only way or that should be the only priority. This should be determined on a local level because strategically speaking, in some contexts, this might be prioritized. In other places, it might not be the priority because strategically, it might be more important to do other things first or at the same time. So I'm totally with you about the issue of land and the importance of returning the land to indigenous groups. But I wouldn't making this another, totalizing discourse and say that this is the only way to go because there are many other social justice projects going on at the same time, and we need that sort of solidarity between us. And for some people, that might be a controversial issue, and we have to find a way to be on the same side instead of, pursuing different goals. That saying, let me make a disclaimer about my presentation today that I didn't say from the beginning. I mean, talking about pedagogy as such, one might argue is a luxury when we have more important issues such as land, which you're probably, you're right, kind of foregrounding it. At the same time, I don't want to underestimate the value of engaging with decolonizing the curriculum, with decolonizing pedagogy, because in some context, that might be the only or the first thing that you could do, pragmatically speaking, before you do many other more radical things. So I wouldn't want to, end the conversation before we even started by saying, well, if you don't project land as the only or major goal, then let's forget about it. I don't want to make that claim.
I guess one of the things I would add, one of the things I would add would be to say that issues like feminism really are addressed very directly when these kinds of systems are engaged, because women's role in reality is around the world is very central to a positive development. It's just not spoken of often.
Yeah.
So
right. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm just conscious there's a couple of other questions as well. Lila? Actually, before Lila, there's a person 833165. It just comes up as a number. There's no name. It's 833165311792 is your number. Yep.
Pavati is me, it's Kari.
Hi. Hi, Kari.
Yeah. Okay, good day. Abubakar Umar Kari from University of Abuja, Nigeria. So I have a simple question. On a scale, this humanizing pedagogy, how can you assess the level of its implementation in South Africa and elsewhere? And what are the major impediments to the smooth implementation of humanizing pedagogy? Thank you.
Well, Kari, thank you for your question. What I've tried to do in this presentation is to say that there is the current understanding of humanizing pedagogies in South African universities, drawing theoretically and conceptually on Freire. And I'm saying that we need to complement that with decolonial thinking. Now, how that is going to be done in practice is I share two ways towards the end of my presentation, but this is really up to each university or each educator to decide whether, this is the trajectory they want to follow. The basic idea is that humanizing pedagogies are not enough, and they include the danger of reproducing colonization because they are grounded in some Eurocentric perspectives. And often we do these sort of pedagogies unconsciously, thinking that we are doing good, but I'm arguing that there are also side effects. There are also consequences if we don't interrogate, not only conceptualize, but obviously in practice, how we use these humanizing pedagogies. For example, projecting the human at the center. The question immediately is, which human? How do we understand human with capital or with lowercase? Which human? So this is what I'm saying. If we make assumptions that are not interrogating the meaning of the human, which usually is the white male, in the literature and the curriculum, then we perpetuate the assumption that this is something that will continue uninterrogated. So what I'm saying is, in our pedagogies, we need to be critical even with noble and progressive ideas, and not stop ever interrogating the assumptions we make about the terminology we use, or the practices we implement, the curricula we use through those practices, and so on. I hope I answered your question, but please feel free to.
Okay, so at this stage, humanizing pedagogy is a recommendation really to institutions to adopt. It has not actually.
Yes, I'm saying exactly. I'm saying this is how it has been used in the literature, and from what I've read on humanizing pedagogies in South Africa, but also elsewhere. And I'm saying, well, let's think about this again, because maybe there are unintended consequences and assumptions that are problematic to make. So when you use this term, or when you think you're implementing these pedagogies in the classroom, think again. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have a recipe, in other words.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I am completely with you. In every word you've said completely resonates with me, and just thank you so much for this conversation. It's partly a comment and a reflection, and would like to see what you think as well. Some appropriation of decolonial discourses, they still tend to privilege this category of nation state, like decolonization in this context or that context, but using the names of the countries. But the idea of nation state itself is a modern construct. Yeah. And rooted in colonially violently drawn borders, and also based on this idea of us and them, and this us appropriates the land and resources and human bodies. So sometimes decolonial conversations tend to re-invoke these frameworks. So that's how do we engage with that? One. Secondly, when we challenge Eurocentrism, what replaces it? And that's where quite often I have noticed that the privileged elites from different regional contexts who already exercise long traditions of coloniality of their own in their context tend to hijack, we want to challenge Western ideas, and then hijack that we have been marginalized, and reassert the regional epistemic material power rooted in history of coloniality of its own. So that appropriation, especially by right-wing supremacist actors. So for example, in Indian Hindutva nationalism claiming coloniality, right? Decolonizing. So just your reflections on some of these challenges.
What a wonderful comment, Laila. I mean, really, I like the way I totally agree with you. This is one of the major problems of talking in decolonial terms. And my good friend Zvi Beckerman and I have done a lot of critique of the nation state, especially in the context of peace education, more relevant to the project that we have here. But really, this is a wonderful comment. It's one of those examples that I mentioned we should be conscious of, not to take for granted even decolonial discourses, because they might be appropriated. And this is a classic example. The nation state is a classic example of appropriation of decolonial discourses. And you're right, we have to make conscious efforts to decolonize the nation state. And there have been efforts not only in peace education, but in many other contexts of trying to do away with the category of the nation state, critique the category. I mean, obviously, given the circumstances and the political realities, it's not an easy thing to do in practice. So we often fall into the trap of reproducing this. But you're absolutely right that this is something that we need to be critically engaged with and be very conscious about, deconstructing this category, both conceptually, methodologically, and politically as well, because there are many political implications. Now, how do we replace Eurocentrism? We don't replace one grand narrative without another grand narrative. This is one of the first lessons I remember from grad school. So I mean, really, I mean, when you said it very well, be conscious of different local, knowledges, acknowledge the value of indigenous knowledge, change, obviously, and deconstruct this hegemonic rule of the normativity of Eurocentrism, but don't replace it with another grand narrative that says, well, Eurocentrism has nothing to, or Eurocentric thinking has nothing to offer. I mean, as you see, I don't like extremes. So I think there has to be a way of valuing all knowledges, but having in mind the structural injustices. For me, that's a priority. Yeah. And the structural injustices and the colonial structures are most of the times, if not all of the times, with Eurocentric. So that's the problem that needs to be deconstructed and replaced with something that is, that does acknowledge the value and appreciate the contributions of native and indigenous knowledge without completely erasing, going to the other end and erasing European thinking. Thank you for your comment, and your questions, really wonderful. Yeah.
No, thank you. That was very helpful.
No, excellent question. I was wondering, actually, is there anyone from South Africa here who would like to comment from the South African perspective about trying humanizing pedagogies? Just jump in.
Hi, I'm from South Africa.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm Mrs. Swatiti. I'm based at UCT in South Africa. And I had raised my question initially, but then I thought, let me just go and answer myself from the internet. And I see that our speaker is based at NMU. And my question was going to be how he is, and where he is thinking of so how is it weighted and where he is thinking from. And I'm asking this because of the statement that South Africa should. So where is that? So I'm just trying to understand him. And also, I would like to know what informs this thinking that this that he is making. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. That's a very good point. Well, I'm an outsider in South Africa. I'm based at the Open University of Cyprus. My experiences of colonialism come from my country being a British colony, and so the should and the ought, it's something, I guess, that is a kind of an ethical position for me that is not going to be undertaken by me myself. I mean, but it's something that is a collective political project that I engage with my South African colleagues. I mentioned earlier under KIT and many other colleagues at Nelson Mandela University or University of Western Cape, other colleagues in South Africa. We have been engaging in decolonization projects for the past 10, 12 years. So in a sense, I'm an outsider, but in some terms you might say I'm an insider in the sense of having the experience of colonization in my own setting, and this is what I'm projecting. I haven't experienced, obviously, the colonization in the context of South Africa, and so in all humility, I'm making the claims that I make from my own context and my own personal experience and my own research in either here or other colonized settings, including South Africa. So I hope that this is a fair answer, but please let me know if you need more clarifications. I'm happy to give them.
No, I think the point that you make about solidarity is also really important because there's something here, and our project also tries to do this, which is to talk about the importance of networking different projects into it, because the solution can never be individual alone. We develop examples of good practice, but then we need to kind of network that into a bigger systems of good practice. So I really agree with you. Morena Lukman, and then Eleni.
Hello, everyone. I was motivated to raise up my hand and speak because I think someone mentioned that people in South Africa should talk so as to contextualize the discussion. Actually, I'm a Nigerian and I'm graduating from my master's program at the University of Cape Town. So I'm speaking to you presently from Cape Town. So I did work on decolonizing curriculum in the University of Cape Town at the backdrop of the Rhodes Must Fall protest, and then a lot of activity that the university has undertaken in the sense of curriculum change framework that was produced in 2018 that also led to a lot of deliberations and arguments in the university, in the sense that if the university wants to prescribe some form of curriculum to the university, so that led to a lot of issues. A lot of committees were formed. Some of them are still working until now. COVID was a distraction. So my work engaged in those areas. But the comment I want to make, especially in relation to my research finding, is neoliberalism is affecting a lot of decolonial engagements. That is the realities of how things work politically, economically. So, and also the government is not providing a lot of support. And according to my research, the government is very modernist in nature, more concerned about internationalization and westernization, more than Africanization and decolonization. Maybe lastly, in the specific to the University of Cape Town, for me, decoloniality, especially decolonizing the curriculum, has been relegated to interested academics. A lot of work is being done, a lot of actions are being undertaken, a lot of departments are rethinking how to decolonize their work, their research, teaching and learning, academia practice, community engagement. But most of these things has been relegated to interested academics, because there is no structure currently in the University of Cape Town that is mandating and making people accountable to reflect on their pedagogy, on their curriculum, on their curriculum content, etc. But activities that are being done are undertaken by interested academics. And for me, this is a good development as well as a limitation. Let me just round it up there, and let's switch that as conversations like these are undertaken, and opportunities for conversations like this, a lot of conversations would happen and a lot of action would also follow, vis-a-vis recognizing that a lot of universities are also taking decolonization as tokenistic decolonization, by they change the names of buildings. That is also happening at the University of Cape Town. But in terms of actions and changing the structures of the university, we have seen limited decolonization in those aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Michalinos?
No, thank you. That was a very nice clarification. And obviously, I'm not so familiar with the decolonization efforts at UCT. I'm familiar with NMU. There is a lot of things going on at the level of higher education transformation, and several universities in South Africa have established units of higher education transformation. Muraina is right in a sense of sometimes this is seen in very tokenistic terms. This is something we have to do because it's trendy. This is something we have to do because it's something that everybody talks about. But it really needs a lot of organization and a lot of systematic efforts to actually decolonize the structures. So many people are impatient because there's not much structural change going on. And it's a valid argument. On the other hand, seeing it from a distance, I mean, my response is, it will take some time to really, deconstruct some of the very strongly rooted structures of colonialism in universities. And it's not only a matter of higher education transformation, it's also social transformation. So unless there is also a comparative social transformation in the society of South Africa and in all domains of public life. I mean, you cannot expect only from the university to decolonize or transform when there is no comparable, changes going on in the society. So there has to be a way, though, that there is, some kind of convergence between the social efforts and the political efforts and the academic efforts. So sometimes some people feel, it's just a couple of academics talk about it in conferences or in webinars like this, and in practice there is not much going on. And partly they are right in the sense of, there is 20 almost 30 years, after 94, and there's still some people not seeing, we're not seeing the radical changes that we have all expected to see in the society. So you cannot expect the university to be an outlier, but I do expect the university to take initiatives, and I do expect the universities, maybe that's why I use the word should, because I do expect the academics and the universities to be at the same time activists and be in the front row of efforts to decolonize.
The important point. I really like the point that you make about about the need for convergence between the political and the economic and the academic, because I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think this also really raises questions about how do you do decolonization in a more deeply embedding colonial system, which is what we're seeing in many parts of the world. Lainey?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. Thank you very much. I wanted to push you a bit on your positionality in order for also people to understand the context of Cyprus, because currently half of Cyprus is still occupied by Turkey. So I think it is important to start reflecting to what Minolo says about the various local histories and how they all fit to the global design of, colonial capitalism, patriarchy, anthropocentrism, etc. So I think it is important to start reflecting on, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, also, various other forms of imperialism that are actually taking place, and also to go back on an earlier comment, the earth is not only land, it's also the sea. And currently, with all the gas that has been found, the gas sources that has been found in the Aegean, like in the sea area of Cyprus, and with all the stagnation of Europe at the time with the energy, Turkey, it might, I don't know, I'm hoping not, but we might see a revival of some old empires there, which links again to how the decolonial debate can link to right-wing imperial nation states again. So it's just a point I wanted to raise, and if you could reflect upon. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleni. Thank you for your question. You're right. I mean, in a sense, Cyprus has been in the, crossword of various colonies and colonizers, and it has been a colony, the most recent one of the British Empire, but it used to be also a colony of the Ottoman Empire. So in a sense, we have the experience of being colonized, and I have the sense that we haven't, as Cypriots, both Greek Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, Cyprus is divided since 1974, in some cases since 1963, because of the Turkish invasion. So I have the sense that this has not settled yet. I mean, the issue of coloniality and colonialism in this context has not been settled, and as a result, I think it has implications not only in society, but also I mean, in the domain that I'm more interested in higher education and the development of the first university in Cyprus, the University of Cyprus, that basically has been modeled after the Western, top university, the Western top university. So in a sense, some of the things that I said about South Africa and the critiques of colonial structures in South Africa are very much resembling, what's going on here in Cyprus. For a long time, I kind of resisted of doing this reflection that you're forcing me to do now, because, or you're encouraging me to do now, because I found it maybe easier to be an outsider in the context of South Africa or Israel or Northern Ireland than with the emotional attachments that you have when you are in this context and you see the immediate kind of results of ongoing coloniality in so many domains of everyday life. And so I really haven't dared yet, besides a few writings, to touch on the decolonization of higher education in Cyprus. I'm hoping that after a lot of work in South Africa, maybe I will find the guts to do something similar in Cyprus as well. But I admit of not doing that sort of reflection as I did with a case of South Africa. I hope that's a satisfying response.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
No, that's also an interesting point for me, because I think if you look at internationalization, then of course there's a whole lot of international students coming to study in Cyprus. And I think there's been a rapid growth of that. So, so it'll be interesting to see what does decolonization mean in the context of, especially of pedagogy, in the context of internationalization. How do you value local knowledges from different places, or is it Cypriot knowledge? So it might be something for us to chat about later as well. Steve, Shara.
Thank you very much for recognizing me. It's great to see you, Michalinos, and to hear.
Hi, Steve.
From you.
Nice to see you too.
Thank you so much.
After so many years, huh?
Exactly, yeah. 2000, I think, 2001.
2000, yeah.
We saw each other, yeah, in East Lansing in Michigan. Yeah, so I am based in Malawi at the, it's called UNICAF University. It's a newer university, it's a private university. And we are developing a program for teachers, new teachers. It's a Bachelor of Education for primary school teachers. And we've been discussing how we can incorporate decoloniality perspectives into the curriculum. But there are limitations. And I think some of the limitations you've alluded to, especially when you talked about, for example, the dangers of extremism and also the dangers of maybe erasing one narrative, one hegemony, and then replacing it with another hegemony. Because as we decolonize, we'd like to bring in maybe more Malawian, more African perspectives, but they are not very developed because they face all these neoliberal impediments, because it's the neoliberal university has been producing knowledge, and it's been at the expense of alternative epistemologies. So it's quite a struggle and something that we have to build. But maybe what I would like to hear from you is whether you've got examples from Cyprus and also maybe from South Africa where this has been tried, working with teachers, knowing that they work with young people, and knowing that when you work with young people, maybe that's where you begin from. Maybe that's how you can begin building something, especially in a context where you've got those impediments, those hurdles. If you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I mean, one of the immediate examples that comes in mind is, how you deal with controversial and sensitive issues. This is also in the context of, Cyprus division. This is also in the context of, how do you talk about apartheid in South Africa? The issues that are, or other issues that are very sensitive, or social injustice. And there have been some examples in the literature of good colleagues in South Africa, how you deal pedagogically with these issues using, pedagogies of social justice, or using and decolonizing pedagogies and so on. I mean, in my context here in Cyprus, I do a lot of work with teachers on controversial issues and sensitive issues, how you teach those issues. And there are ways of introducing, different perspectives and exploring, contested narratives from different perspectives. And the purpose is to sensitize students to become more critically conscious about those. You don't want to indoctrinate, in a sense, students. You want them to be sensitized about social injustices and social structures. And hopefully, if you're lucky, you can also engage in local projects. So with pre-service teachers, we have them, do local projects in the community of addressing, some sort of an injustice that they want to address. With practicing teachers, we work a lot with how to introduce in the classroom issues of controversial issues and sensitive issues, like the division of Cyprus. How do you talk about the historical trauma of colonization, of ongoing Turkish occupation, without instilling more hatred? And at the same time, going even a step further, promoting peace and perhaps reconciliation and mutual understanding as well. So these are the things we are exploring. We written about, these efforts. Sometimes they are successful, sometimes they are not successful. And this is part of this effort. It's not like, if you do this, if you use, decolonizing pedagogies, then it will be successful, and the minds of the students will be decolonized. It doesn't go like that. It's not a recipe. It requires a lot of, strategic moves. And in some of our publications, we have been talking about these strategic moves that need to be determined contextually. That's why the context is so important. I cannot talk theoretically or abstractly about, South Africa, because I haven't done so much work with teachers in South Africa. I'm talking about work with teachers in Cyprus, because there are some strategic moves that you can take in Cyprus. For example, introducing some humanizing terms, some humanizing terminology at the beginning and as an entry point, and then complicating the discourses. So in a sense, that's why I'm not rejecting Freire-based humanizing pedagogies. I'm just saying you can use them as an entry point, and then enrich them with decolonizing discourses and decolonizing pedagogies. And this is what we are trying to do here in Cyprus with the teaching of sensitive and controversial issues, building on some of the Council of Europe's work on similar issues, but localizing them, taking into consideration, the local complexities, the sensitivities of this context. So I don't know if that is a satisfying answer, but we can certainly talk more over email, and I would be happy to continue the conversation with you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely helpful. Yeah, and we'll pick it up from here over email. Thank you so much.
There were a few comments on the chat as well. So I think Kiruba had some really interesting comments, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think most of them were comments. I think there's one question. Alison Mlitwa says that in her experiences of South African higher education, the approaches to decolonization have largely been softer form, which I think, is very much what we hear here.
Right.
We did hear from Neziswa, which I think is great. I think Mo, you had a question. Mo?
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My question was, I understand the reconstruction of South Africa has been anchored on Ubuntu with quite a number of proponents, including Desmond Tutu. How do your harmonizing efforts dovetail with the philosophy of Ubuntu? Because I understand from the presentation, you were talking about humanizing the curriculum as well as trying to decolonize it.
Well, the Ubuntu philosophy is a nice example of, a local concept in throughout Africa that could certainly be used as one of those, contributions of African knowledges. So you could easily forget about, humanizing pedagogy of Freire and actually use the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is a very much, African concept in many parts of Africa as well. So yes, I mean, the answer is it's perfectly compatible with decolonial thinking. I haven't done, this sort of kind of matching and comparative work between the two concepts, but I think there is a lot of potential there, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody else hasn't done it already in the literature.
Yeah, though of course there is a feminist critique of Ubuntu, which has been long and ongoing, and particularly that relationship between Confucianism, fair ethics, Ubuntu, that whole set of things has been discussed, particularly in philosophy and political philosophy elsewhere. So yeah, no, thanks very much for that question and response. We had Alice, did you want to say that? What you were?
Yeah, I just wanted to reaffirm what is it, Mo Panganai said something about Ubuntu. And in my research that I did for young immigrants, which I finished this year, I found most of the young people were struggling at university or in different spaces or in primary school. The 1.5 generation, in geography, we call them 1.5 generation, those who were born in their own country who come here when they're small. That Ubuntu, they understood it as the one that grounded it in difficult circumstances when it comes to racism and all the other things they didn't understand, especially in classes where they found students were shouting at their teacher, and they hadn't heard about that in Africa, and it was quite difficult for them. But Ubuntu was one of the things that have seen them through in so many difficult circumstances in the UK. So I just wanted to emphasize how it's quite a philosophy without us asking the questions as such to the young people. They actually came out with them, how they found the space and their identity and how they managed it in different spaces. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. We're actually right out of time, and I think we've more or less covered most people's questions and points, not quite everybody's, but with such a rich talk, it was impossible to cover everything. So can I just say thank you so much for Michalinos for all the, for a wonderful talk, and to all the people here for their, contributions to what I think is such an important and ongoing conversation. I'm sure we'll all be back in touch again to talk about this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Parvati. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.